Once, in a small town lost among dense forests, an ambulance service was operating. The shift that evening was especially tense. There was an inexplicable sense of dread in the air. On the ambulance were Nurse Emma and paramedic Martin. They were professionals, but something felt off that night. They received a call from an old, abandoned house on the edge of town. Locals had long claimed that something malevolent resided there, but the call was urgent, and they couldn't ignore it. When they arrived, the house looked even more frightening than usual. Rotten wood creaking in the dark and a thick fog shrouding it gave the impression that this house didn't belong in reality. Emma and Martin entered the house, lighting their way with flashlights. Inside, everything was in utter chaos, old belongings scattered on the floor, and a strange smell of decay. They headed to the room from which the call had come. Inside, they were met by an old, disheveled man who looked extremely frightened. "Help me, please," he pleaded. "She's back. She's come for me." The room was cold, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. Emma and Martin tried to calm the old man, but his fear was so intense that he couldn't explain what was happening. Suddenly, the flashlight beams began to flicker, and strange noises came from the other end of the house, a scraping sound, as if something large was moving across the floor. Emma and Martin exchanged worried glances but decided to investigate the source of the sounds. They slowly approached the staircase leading to the second floor. Every step on the creaking stairs filled their hearts with terror. When they reached the top, the flashlights began to flicker even more intensely. In one of the rooms, they saw that the door was ajar, and inside was an old, dusty bed. A sharp crack made them turn. Suddenly, the room's door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. At that moment, in the corner, they saw a blurry spot resembling a human shadow, but with unnatural, twisted movements. The old man downstairs suddenly started screaming. Emma and Martin hurried back, but when they returned to the room, the old man was gone. Instead, they saw that the room was filled with a strange, dark fog. Suddenly, the fog thickened and began to move as if it were a living entity. Emma and Martin, gripped by panic, fled from the house and, despite their fear, called the police. When the officers arrived, they found the house empty. There was no sign of the old man or any evidence of what had happened. One fact remained indisputable: the house was silent and empty once more. But the townspeople knew that the place had become even more sinister. Every night, if anyone dared to approach the house, they could hear sounds of fear and creaking, as if something didn't want anyone to be there. Emma and Martin could never explain what happened that night, but they knew one thing: sometimes the fear in an old house can be more real than any physical threat. I was an emergency medical worker and firefighter. One night, we received a call to check on the health of a person who had called 112 but was not responding to the operator. We arrived at the address and the house looked strange. An elderly woman greeted us at the door. We asked if she knew who had called 112, but she said she lived alone since her husband had passed away. As soon as we returned to the station, another call came in from the same address. We went back, spoke to the elderly woman again, and then left. Just as we were returning to the station, the same call came in from the same address with no response. We headed back, thinking the old woman might be having some sort of mental episode, but when we arrived, she was no longer at the door. We rang the bell, but there was no answer. The door was unlocked, and when we looked inside, we saw that the elderly woman was lying on the floor and not breathing. We immediately performed first aid and took her to the hospital. She was in stable condition. Upon waking in the ambulance, she insisted that she hadn't called us and that we arrived almost immediately after she lost consciousness. It was a 15-minute drive from the station to her house. Before taking her to the hospital, she asked me and another EMT to bring her knitting needles and some clothing. I agreed to pick up her things since I had a friend living in that area, and we were already planning to meet up. I stopped by to pick up my friend, and we went to the elderly woman's house. I went in to get the bag with her things while my friend stayed in the car. As I was leaving the house, I swear I felt a hand on my back and heard a voice saying thank you. When I returned to the car, my friend asked why the elderly woman's husband couldn't bring the items to the hospital himself. I told him that her husband was dead, to which my friend responded that someone had been standing at the window and waved at him. At first, I refused to believe in the supernatural, so I called the police to inspect the house. I thought someone might have broken in. The police found nothing unusual, and no one was inside. Later, my friend and I returned to the elderly woman. He started describing the old man who had been at the window, and the elderly woman immediately began to cry. She said it was her husband. Now, I can't hold back tears, and it's hard to dismiss ghost stories when something like this happens to you personally. One dark night, as rain drummed on the roof and the wind howled through the vents, an urgent call came into one of the city's ambulances. Strange noises were reported from an old, abandoned house in the suburbs. The on-duty paramedic, Daniel, and his partner, Sylvia, decided to head out to investigate the call without waiting for further instructions. When they arrived at the scene, the moon only partially illuminated the front yard. The house looked as if it hadn't seen people in years. The windows were boarded up, and bushes grew up to the doors. They cautiously approached the entrance, and Daniel began knocking. The silence was eerie and unnatural until they heard footsteps from inside. An elderly woman, trembling with fear, answered the door. She explained that strange, terrifying sounds were coming from the house, as if someone was plotting something dreadful. Sylvia, who was always the rational one, reassured the woman and suggested they check the house. They inspected the rooms one by one. Each room was the same, silent and devoid of life. But when they reached the final room in the attic, they began to hear a sound like scraping. Suddenly, the lights went out, leaving them in pitch darkness. Daniel turned on his flashlight, and as the beam swept across the wall, they saw bloodstains on the floor. Suddenly, Sylvia noticed movement, a figure hidden in the corner of the room behind an old sheet. As they approached, they pulled back the sheet and were confronted with a horrifying scene. An old hoisting mechanism on the wall used to create strange noises in the attic. At that moment, they heard another sound, the same scraping, but now coming from beneath them. When they turned to leave, they saw that the doors they had used were barricaded from the inside. A mocking voice emerged from the darkness. "Thank you for coming. Now you will stay here forever." During an evening shift at one of the ambulances, Felix and Laura were on duty. The shift went as usual until a strange call came in with coordinates pointing to a local cemetery. The call stated that someone was in need of help. When they arrived at the cemetery, the night was dark and the moon barely illuminated the graves. Both felt a chill run down their spines. At the end of one of the paths, they encountered an old man with deep wrinkles and white hair, acting extremely strangely. He pointed to a grave and said that his wife was buried there and was in distress. Felix and Laura, sensing that something was off, began to investigate, discovering that the grave had been recently dug up and was still open. At that moment, a strange, barely audible crackling noise echoed through the cemetery. Laura shone her flashlight on the grave and noticed something dark moving below. They cautiously began to work, and when they cleared the grave, they found the coffin was open. Inside, to their horror, there was no body, only an old, dirty suit and a pair of white hairs. Suddenly, the old man vanished, and on the grave was left a sign with the inscription, "Death is not the end, it is a transition." At that moment, as they were preparing to leave, the ground beneath them began to shake, and something unseen grabbed their legs, dragging them into the grave. A few hours later, when other staff members arrived at the scene, they found only the empty ambulance and strange footprints on the ground leading to the deepest grave. And that night, someone heard a whisper in the air, "You are not alone."